Welcome, everyone, to our first Nucleus webinar. I will be your host for the afternoon, morning, depending on where you're joining from. Today, we have a wonderful topic we would like to share with everyone. And if I can move my slides forward. So today's topic, what does Novartis's pursuit of a label expansion for Pluvicto possibly mean for patients and the field of radiopharmaceutical therapies? Before I get to introduce our panelists, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping rules. I'm Chad Cruikshanks, the Senior Director of Marketing at Nucleus RadioPharma, and will be the host for today's meeting. This meeting is being recorded. Second, please utilize the Q&A function within Zoom to ask any questions. And once the presentation is over, I will be asking questions to our panelists to answer any questions you may have. And then finally, is during the webinar, the Nucleus team will provide a background on Novartis's pursuit of the label expansion for Pluvicto in the pre-taxane metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer space, and give you a little bit of an overview from Dr. Johnson's perspective. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our first panelist. Dr. Geoff Johnson is the founder and chief scientific officer at Nucleus RadioPharma. Dr. Johnson is board certified in radiology and nuclear medicine and recently rotated out of an 8-year tenure as chair of nuclear medicine at Mayo Clinic. Under his leadership, Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota has become the largest theranostic center in the world, averaging 40 therapies per week in 2023. Dr. Johnson now serves as associate director of the Mayo Clinic Comprehensive Cancer Center and is chair of radiopharmaceutical therapy. Dr. Johnson was the top recruiting physician in the Mayo system in 2022 and has enrolled over 140 patients on radiopharmaceutical cancer therapy trials in the last 3 years, serving as overall PI and local PI. He also serves as co-PI on multiple active theranostic trials. Joining Geoff will be Kathy Spencer-Pike, Chief Commercial Officer of Nucleus RadioPharma. KSP brings more than 2 decades of experience with highly matrixed Fortune 50 environments, as well as fast-paced growth and startup enterprises. Before Nucleus, she was the chief sales officer at McKesson, where she spurred significant company growth, built a high-performance commercial team, and merged 3 legacy organizations into a single commercial organization, achieving unprecedented double-digit growth year over year. KSP previously was VP commercial leader for Novo Nordisk, successfully leading the planning, development, and execution of market and sales strategies, exceeding revenue goals. In addition to her commercial experience, Ms. Spencer-Pike is a dedicated advocate for DE&I, leading the largest U.S.-based women's employee resource group at Pfizer and Novo Nordisk, both of which were the largest ERGs within those companies. So with those introductions, KSP, I would like to turn it over to you and Geoff.
Super. Chad, thank you for that warm welcome. I just wanted to quickly let you know from a tech perspective, we are unable to start our video. And I know our audience really wants to see Geoff's face.
Wow.
So if the folks on listening to us right now can hang tight, of course, we can chat without necessarily you seeing us, but
Check. Okay.
let's see. Check. Hold on, everyone. Maybe those 3 dots.
I just did that one.
No. Okay. Oh,
The glitches of our first webinar.
absolutely.
Yeah, it was
right?
working. Oh, there we go.
see,
Fixed it. Thank you.
Exactly.
Good morning, everybody.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So Chad, again, thank you for the warm introductions, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I think that covers all time zones.
Yeah.
I'm super excited to be sitting here with Geoff in our offices up here in Rochester, Minnesota. And I'm equally excited to be talking about this topic with Geoff. So Chad teed us up, I think, really nicely, Geoff. But it's been since early October since Novartis announced their pursuit of a label expansion. Can you give our folks a quick refresh on that?
Yeah. So right now we treat patients with Pluvicto or lutetium PSMA 617 who are at the end of their cancer journey. They basically have failed everything, including chemotherapy. And unfortunately, a lot of patients don't tolerate chemotherapy or don't even want to try because they know how difficult it was for friends of theirs or loved ones who have had to go undergo chemotherapy. So in addition to that, a lot of physicians, they don't want to treat their patients with it. They say, it's not a good risk-benefit ratio for a lot of our patients. So being able to show that lutetium PSMA 617 is effective and safe in a population of patients who have not received chemo is a really big deal. It's a big deal for our patients, our referring physicians, for us as we treat these patients in our nuclear medicine practice. And it will also have a significant increase in the number of patients who are eligible for the therapy. And we think we'll have a significant increase in the number of patients we end up treating, assuming the FDA agrees to the data in the PSMA-4 trial and allows the indication on the package insert to be, useful for us.
Super.
Yep.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So with that fact, with Novartis and the fact that we know Lantheus and Curium are also pursuing pre-chemo indications for their assets, it would appear that RLT therapy pre-chemo is inevitable. I think, as you mentioned, it's exciting to see the upsides on that, but do you see any potential barriers or risks to moving it up in protocol?
Well, I mean, I wish it was inevitable. It hurts me to even think that we wouldn't be able to go into this group of patients who've never seen chemo. Having said that, the data on the trials, they had a little bump in the road there, shall we say. So if we step back and we look at the VISION trial, which was the multi-center phase 3 trial that led to the FDA approval of lutetium PSMA 617 for prostate cancer patients. That was done without a crossover, meaning that if the patient was not receiving the research therapy at the time, the lutetium PSMA 617, they didn't have the option once they progressed or had their cancer recur to jump onto the therapy, right? And so as a result, a lot of patients dropped out of the study. It was actually a problem in making sure that we had enough patients who made it all the way through that trial to have good data in the end. And the patients complained and there was enrollment, stress there. So intelligently, the VISION trial, the PSMA-4 trial, which is the one we're focused on now, plus SPLASH and ECLIPSE, all designed their trials with crossover. Okay, and this is great in a number of ways. It's really good for patients. So if they're put on the control arm and they don't actually get to receive the research radiopharmaceutical therapy, they eventually get to cross over and get it later if they want to. That's great, but the problem is that if you do that, and a lot of patients cross over, which was the shocking thing. I mean, these therapies they're pretty good. So, and the patients are pretty excited about them. So, there were unprecedented numbers of patients who crossed over, greater than 80%. And then when you look at, here's the kicker, you look at the long-term outcome. So you look at the patients, whether they've passed away or survived, and most of the patients on both arms actually got the therapy.
Wow.
So, I mean, there's two endpoints here. One is the progression-free survival and one is the overall survival. It was that overall survival data when most patients got the therapy that created a bump in the road and created a delay. So we had to wait for the data to, as they say, mature, which is a hard way of saying that you have to wait for some of the patients to actually pass away. And now, the data is looking in the right direction. And so we have really good data from the PSMA-4 trial saying that we give a long delay before the patient's cancer progresses. And now we have data that says they're less likely to pass away if they receive the therapy. And you really need to have both for the FDA to be comfortable moving forward. And so those are the bumps in the road. And we also really don't know until the FDA responds what's going to happen.
So let me, your comments really kind of sparked so many different questions for me. Yep. So the lessons that you've just kind of described, the bumps in the road, is that now forcing different trial designs moving forward?
We're always balancing trial designs. And, it's really easy to look at a trial and second guess it and say, you should have done this, right? But it's also interesting to see when you go and do the things that you quote should have done, there are other things that can become problems, right? So there is no perfect trial design. You want to keep it simple. You want to make it very doable. You want to make it so that once you go through the whole trial and you actually get an FDA approval, it actually makes sense for clinical practice. So, and there's a lot of really, deep thought and experience that goes into this. And I'm a nuclear medicine physician. I add in my component here because I do treat these patients, but it's really the deep experience of our medical oncologist colleagues and our urologists and other folks who have been doing trial design for decades who weigh in here. But you're correct. I mean, there's a lot of things, and some of them affect supply chain, to the interest here to say, do you standardize the dose? Do you allow the dose to change for a given patient when we could? Those are all factors that get weighed into the process and have significant implications in the end.
So I want to come back to supply chain in just a little bit, but before we do that, I'd love to ask you a question really kind of through the lens of a patient. So as you said, they get excited about this. They're, with the thought or the possibility of never necessarily needing chemo. So is it possible that standard of care begins to change and RLT replaces the need for chemo?
Yeah. So, and actually, to chat, I think we can take the slides down as we chit chat here. So when you look at standard of care, it's always evolving, right? And there's the standard of care at leading centers, which might be pushing the barriers or the borders on some of the things that we're doing, and the trials that those are based on, and then the standards that come out in, say, the NCCN guidelines. These things are always in flux. So you will find different things at different practices. I mean, even now you see people using different imaging to both select and guide and follow patients as PSMA imaging becomes more available. And, do we use it for following? Do we still need to do bone scans and CT scans? So the standard of care when it comes to your specific question, Kathy, of do we envision the FDA approving this? We do, we hope. I would be surprised, but it's not guaranteed, but that this gets approved and we're able to take a patient who has castrate resistant, that means they are progressing on hormone therapies in both kind of the basic ones and the advanced ones, metastatic progressive disease, and have never seen chemo. I would think, given our experience, that the majority of them will probably go on a radioligand or radiopharmaceutical therapy, like a PSMA targeted therapy. And we don't cure patients with these therapies, right? So then the cancer comes back. And so where does chemo come into play in this milieu? Does it become a line you do after RLT? Do you go and do, say, 6 doses of a radiopharmaceutical or RLT therapy, wait, and then do it again? Because a lot of the time I think that we can, and we're gathering data there. And I think a lot of people, and I would agree, unlike chemo, if you have a patient who responded well and tolerated these therapies well, the general gestalt is they're likely to have a good response again. And so, to the point of testing their toxicity in studies right now to prove to ourselves and the FDA that we can give many, many more doses of these drugs safely is something that is ongoing. So it's all evolving. I absolutely think that if a patient is progressing on a PSMA targeted lutetium therapy, you might add a chemotherapy. You might add an immunotherapy. Those are studies that are also ongoing. So the role of chemo, it will still be there. I mean, if you've got a patient who has failed or even progressed on radiopharmaceutical therapy, I think chemo is something you would certainly consider. But I do think that we will probably see a change, and most people will get radiopharmaceutical therapies before chemotherapy. Yeah.
So then, being the eternal optimist, we know triplet therapy, right? Treatment intensification,
Yep.
is really the way to go with, certainly to your point, advanced stage,
Yep.
high volume. So could that be
Quadruple
therapy,
let, yes.
that you add an RLT to that?
So to step back for a second, Kathy is commenting on the fact that in certain populations, even patients who have at the very diagnosis, what we call de novo metastatic cancer, there is data now to say that the long-term outcome of those patients may be better if you treat them with multiple lines of hormone therapy, which would be ADT and ARPI, and add in chemotherapy, so triple therapy right at the onset of their cancer. And even though in many of those patients the hormone therapies alone might be helpful, the overall benefit of adding the chemo is there. So we can't use radiopharmaceutical therapies in that early stage yet. We are looking at the PSMA addition trial, which has finished enrollment. And in that population, the patients are hormone sensitive, meaning they haven't failed, they haven't progressed in the face of a hormone therapy, which should shut off the growth of many kinds of cancers. Many types of prostate cancer. So I think the opportunity is there to ask the question. And certainly in late stage patients, even though we're not combining in clinical practice chemotherapy with radiopharmaceutical therapy, we absolutely are combining ADT, ARPI, and radiopharmaceutical therapy right now. And the patients, for the most part, seem to tolerate it pretty well. So again, you might look at it from a patient point of view and say, isn't the whole goal of this to use a really low toxicity radiopharmaceutical therapy so I don't have to do chemotherapy?
Sure.
So I don't have to do hormonal therapy? But I think we would also recognize that if you have data to say, hey, we can knock your cancer back for years and give you a long-term break, then I think it's worth bringing those in.
For sure. I have a question that's a related question, but I know that you have your hands in a lot of different things, and I know you stay really up to date on kind of the reimbursement, the FDA, and what's happening from kind of a payment perspective. You've just talked through a lot of exciting advancement in the standard of care, treatment protocols, what's happening in clinical trials. Do you believe, just from your opinion and from your vantage point, do you believe that the FDA and really the reimbursement landscape is keeping pace? Kind of a loaded question, I know.
So recently there were some good signs along that road, which is I think what you're hinting at. So with a radiopharmaceutical therapy, with PSMA in particular, not all patients who have prostate cancer have PSMA-avid prostate cancer, meaning these drugs float around in the blood and stick to cancer that has PSMA on its cell surface. It has to have that receptor on there. And we see that on the PET scans that we use to select the patients. So some patients, it's a minority, but not insignificant number of patients, they either have one or multiple or all their sites of cancer where our radiopharmaceutical therapies that bind PSMA don't go to their cancer. So we know that if you can't get the drug to go to the cancer, you're not going to radiate the cancer. It's not going to be very effective for the patient. So we have to do a PSMA PET scan to select the patients, basically to tell the patients that aren't going to benefit, it's not worth doing this. You need to try something else, right? And so the problem is that those PET scans aren't reimbursed very well. And it's specifically, it's the radiopharmaceutical that we use for the PET scan. So it's the medication, the radioactive.
That is required.
That you have, yes.
Okay.
So when you inject a PSMA PET imaging radiopharmaceutical, a classic example would be gallium PSMA 11.
Okay.
Another one would be what's trade name Pylarify or F18 PSMA DCFPYL. Okay, mouthful. So those are two FDA approved, and then now there's another word with the trade name Posluma, which is a PSMA RH molecule. So Those three can be used to image patients' PSMA expression. And without going into the details of the specifics of the package insert on which ones can be used for selecting for therapy, which is another thing, I would say that when you get reimbursed for those, for 3 years, you get paid for, the hospital gets paid for the drug.
Okay.
Unfortunately, after 3 years, that quote pass-through ends, and then the hospital gets paid pennies on the dollar for the radiopharmaceutical, to the point that the hospital loses money on the scan.
Okay, let me restate that to make sure I'm tracking, and maybe so for the first
Yeah.
3 years of the launch, there's
Correct.
reimbursement.
Correct.
So after
Good reimbursement
from
Medicare.
From Medicare.
Yeah.
Okay. After 3 years, so
Yep.
3 years into the life cycle of
Yep.
that drug, reimbursement drops to the point hospitals lose money.
And this is not for the therapies. So to be clear here,
Okay.
this is the diagnostic. So with every theranostic, you have an imaging drug and a therapy drug in a pair with radiopharmaceuticals. That's what we call theranostics, therapy diagnostics. So if you say the hospital is going to lose money on the scan because they have to pay this much for the PSMA imaging agent and they get paid this much, and so they lose so much money on the radio tracer or the radiopharmaceutical for imaging that they can't make it up on the rest of the scan, a lot of hospitals say, well, you know what, I'm not going to do it anymore.
Sure.
So there's been a law, I'm going to try to make this brief, but it is related and it's exciting. It kind of newly came up. So if the FIND Act, F-I-N-D Act, was moving through Congress, and the FIND Act proposed a financial solution to this, which was basically to get rid of the pass-through, but to reduce reimbursement for standard FDG PET, which is the majority of, that's a glucose PET. It's something we're not talking about theranostics, but that's what most PET scans are. So they'd make it cost neutral, meaning we'd pay more for things like PSMA PET.
Okay.
And allow hospitals to, especially small hospitals that are really tight on budgets, to be able to provide these scans so that a patient would know if they're eligible for the therapy. Luckily, the CMS now has come out with a new guidance proposal, and this is recent, that basically bakes in the FIND Act concept into new guidance, and it's open for comment right now. And hopefully from my point of view, from my patient's point of view, I want patients to have good access to these PSMA PET scans or dotatate PET scans or other beyond 3 years from each one of these drugs comes out, so that we can keep identifying them and saying, okay, yes, you're a good candidate for therapy. So I have high hopes that that will go through. Again, it's not guaranteed, but if it does, it will be a big win for companies that are investing in these technologies, so that they can say, I'm going to develop this imaging agent that goes with the therapy. I'm going to pay into that effort because I can get some reimbursement, and it'll be clearly a benefit for our patients and help support theranostics.
Well, and you just touched on it. If I go back and put my pharma hat on, you just touched on what is to me most concerning about future and continued innovation and investment on the imaging side, because very rarely will a company be able to recoup their expenses to get that imaging agent to commercialization in 3 years.
Unfortunately, that's true. And, as a physician, you could put your hat on and say, everything should be cheaper for everybody. And I agree. But we got to get these therapies to patients.
That's right.
And we got to develop this technology, and then we can figure out how to make them cheaper, would be my view of it. These are very difficult technologies to develop, and the supply chains and et cetera are expensive. Having said that, as they grow, that's the way the whole system's supposed to work. The cost should come down over time.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and I think, we know firsthand that the PSMA PET is really critical to identifying that advanced stages. So,
yes.
Yeah, I hope everyone takes what Geoff just kind of provided in terms of a bit of insight and context on the act, and they can speak up to their local politicians and weigh in. All right, and again, I want to reiterate what Chad said at the very beginning of our broadcast, which is, if you have questions, feel free, do not wait to the end. You can put them in chat, and we've got Chad and Catherine monitoring the Q&A feature. So Geoff and I are happy to take on any questions along the way. So
any questions, Chad?
Oh,
There is one that's come in, and
Okay.
it was an earlier comment that you made about the crossover from
Yeah.
PSMA4, but the question is in regards to Splash, Eclipse, and PSMA4.
Yep.
Are there any what's it say? Any intricacies of the trials that one drug might have a leg up over the other in the
oh.
design of the trial?
So-
Oh, that's
So
Loaded
I will be
question.
political here,
Yes.
right? So
You want all horses to win.
there is controversy between PSMA I and T and PSMA 617 as to which one is, quote, better. And so if you look at some data would suggest that they're basically equivalent. Okay. And that is not an unreasonable way to look at this. They've both been used in kind of expanded access types of programs in Europe for years. There's a lot of experience. Then they've also been looked at in trials. If you look at the SPLASH trial, they were limited when they went through the FDA to a lower dose. Okay, so if we set aside the drugs and we could split out like those two different drugs and say, you know, there might be slightly more tumor uptake in some patients with PSMA 617. There might be slightly more renal binding with PSMA I and T by some sources, and other sources suggest that it's a wash and they're basically identical. So, however, if you look at what they were able to do with the SPLASH trial in terms of the amount of drug they were allowed to give a patient, they were allowed to give less drug. Okay, so in other words, because of the limitations that the FDA set as to the maximum limits, because of concern of renal injury or other things, which we now know are far less of a concern than we thought they would be, right? When that trial was designed, they were limited. And so it's therefore not particularly surprising that the progression-free survival benefit might be lower if you can't give as much medication in the trial. So, you know, that is something that you can consider. But you know, I think as the data comes out, there is high hope that people will consider both PSMA 617 and PSMA I and T effective and safe in this pre-chemotherapy or pre-taxane population. So I hope I answered your question. But there are other nuances and more minor differences, but those are probably some of the key ones.
And I think you, as Chad's scrolling to see if there's any additional questions, I think really the takeaway from that is details matter, nuances matter, and not every clinical trial is certainly designed the same. And so to take a look and kind of draw conclusions quickly is
yeah,
you just really need to kind of dig in deeper. All right, Chad, any additional questions before we continue?
Yeah, none at this time.
All right.
Excellent. All right, let's revisit supply chain.
Okay.
So I know we're, of course, the focus of this webinar is on the prostate cancer side of things,
Right.
but we know, and this is especially, I think, exciting for everyone, our targets are becoming much broader and bigger: breast cancer, neuroendocrine, right? Glioblastoma. I mean, it's really getting exciting. But that also taxes what we already know. Anyone who's been in the radio space for any length of time knows that supply chain can be challenging. Can you speak a little bit to that, and if you see significant improvements?
Well, I mean, yes, I think we're continuing to improve. And the question is not so much whether the supply chain is improving. It's more of a question of, is the supply chain improving to be at pace with the science and the population of patients we're hoping to treat on trials and as well as in clinical practice. So, people are aware in both the imaging radiopharmaceutical space for decades, as well as in the therapy space, there have been multiple supply chain issues for multiple different reasons. And to give people credit, I'll just kind of give you a general idea. When the PSMA 617 therapy first became FDA approved, it was coming into the US by the following manner. There was a company in Germany, ITM, that was making or producing the lutetium that was coming from Germany. That went to a site in Italy being run by Novartis, where they were manufacturing under CGMP, good manufacturing practices, the final product that had to meet all specifications. Then that was qualified and it could be shipped overseas to the US. And there's two different things here for supply chain. There's get technical here, but there's the physical half-life of the radionuclide, which means for lutetium, every about 6 days or so, half of it's gone. And that is one of the most reliable things in nature, is the half-life of a radioactive atom. So after 6 days, half of the active ingredient is gone. Now, there's also the shelf stability. And that is the critical thing to think about. So when at the point at which they finish manufacturing in Italy, or did at that time, now they're manufacturing in both New Jersey and Indianapolis. But once they finish manufacturing, the FDA had accepted that was a good drug product for 5 days. And that's the shelf stability. That's the time frame before which you have to inject it into your patient. That's how much time you have to get it.
So from dose to patient. From
the final dose production to the patient, 5 days. And that brings in other factors like is the molecule breaking down? Right? Is it falling apart as it's radiating itself to a certain degree, or other factors in terms of its stability? So they're not shelf stable. Lutetium dotatate, for example, has a 3-day shelf stability, so it's even shorter. So you can produce a lot more drug with a lot more radioactivity,
accounting for
distance, and so that by the time it gets to the patient, you have the right dose. But so stepping back and going back from that kind of conversation to kind of put it in frame and say, okay, now how do we deal with, how do we look at this new PSMA 4 trial, the increase in patient population of prostate cancer, and then we can go into the other cancers. So depending on who you ask, depending on which practice you look at, everyone thinks that we're going to significantly increase the number of patients we want to treat with PSMA therapies. Once the FDA hopefully approves that we can treat patients who've never seen chemotherapy. I've seen estimates between double and quadruple the number of patients. And so if you're working at an academic practice or a private, maybe 80% of these people, 80% of prostate cancer patients are treated at local hospitals, but not yet do we get a lot of these therapies into those local hospitals. These therapies are a little more destination medical center still, so a little more academic in where we're delivering them. Now, when you go to those practices, if they're not treating patients with chemo, they're refusing it, then a lot of patients are never, ever going to be eligible for PSMA 617, or for that matter, PSMA INT. And so once they say they don't have to be on chemo, all of a sudden they're going to have a quadrupling of the patients. Other practices that do chemo more aggressively are going to see a smaller increase in their population. Regardless, when you see that, what you're going to see initially is all of these patients who are waiting. Okay. And granted, they can't wait forever because their cancer progresses, but there are a lot of patients who will flip from waiting to wanting to be on this therapy soon as the FDA makes any change. And that backlog is hard to predict, and that kind of peak and then the flow back. So I don't work for Novartis. They are aware of all of this. They're preparing those things, but and they are ramping up different lines and things. And fingers crossed that things will go well with that transition. As we add multiple other things, then you start thinking about the radionuclide production. So right now, the supply chain bottleneck for lutetium PSMA is probably multiple. It's probably not the lutetium. It's probably more, do we have enough sites that are actually doing the combining of the lutetium to the peptide and making the drug product? Do we have enough hospitals and physicians who know how to treat these patients? Do they have enough beds? Do they have enough, people who can maintain the cleanliness and the radioactive safety and things like that? Do they work together well? I mean, if you look right now, there are well over 200 sites in the U.S. that say they can treat these patients. Some of them have treated like one. Some of them have treated once a month. Some of them have access to a room on Friday afternoon, and other ones are building out centers. Like they just announced that Indiana University just announced that they're opening a 6 bed theranostic center just recently. We've got 23 here at Mayo. So there's clearly bottlenecks at multiple levels.
Thank you for that. And as you're talking, I'm thinking of that glut, that bolus of patients that if in fact standard of care is modified to treat patients pre-chemo. I think about all the community-based physicians that are really not in, and I don't mean any disrespect to community-based medicine, but they just don't have the knowledge. They don't have the facilities. They don't have the capabilities. And how many patients sit in those more rural community-based environments? And how do we take the amazing work that a Mayo is doing, that are other flagship cancer centers, and how do we begin to, propagate that more broadly?
Yeah, that's an ongoing battle.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of work to be done there. And we're much better off than we were 5 years ago. But that's not saying much. I think that will continue to be a limitation. And not every patient who's elderly or fighting with metastatic cancer is able or willing to travel a distance to a major medical center, or has the financial resources to do it. So those are all factors. When you go into other radionuclides, especially, there are other things to consider: actinium, lead. Those supply chains are more nascent. And require more development. And, we're seeing some of that in the clinical trial supply chains right now. There are lots of technologies in the pipeline and lots of companies working on pretty much all of these therapeutic radionuclides that are particularly interesting right now, to various degrees. So there's a little bit of a bet, we're gonna launch all these really great drugs for breast cancer, lung cancer. We're going after these things, and everyone's kind of hoping that some of these companies that say, hey, I've got this really great technology that's going to solve the supply chain problem. It's like, okay,
fingers crossed.
Please and thank you.
Right.
And then you're still left with the lack of infrastructure of the facilities to produce them, and the ability to scale them. So another way to look at that is to say, let's say you're a startup company or an academic person who's developed a new drug or has a new drug you're trying to bring forward as a radiopharmaceutical therapy. And, you can actually go through clinical trials faster with a radiopharmaceutical therapy than most chemotherapies or immunotherapies, because you have the imaging to show that where the drug is going. So you can convince the FDA to let you move faster, because you can say, hey, I'm probably not going to get side effects in these areas because there isn't any drug there. Right.
And that's the precision that we talk about when we talk about precision medicine.
Right. So, that's, we can talk about how awesome these drugs are. I get excited because I think they're very exciting. But as you go through those steps, because you can expedite the trials, then you have this flip. Ooh, that's kind of cool. You have this flip where you go from getting an approval or flipping to a phase 3 and then getting an approval, and you say, okay, now I want to ramp up production. And the ability to produce or build a drug manufacturing site that is that has the radioactivity is harder and slower. And the supply chains of all the material there. So it is very easy to have those misaligned. And those are all things that are, they're expensive and difficult to figure out. But we're getting there.
Absolutely. And I'm conscious of time. And so, Chad, let me check in as perhaps Geoff and I begin to wrap up. Check to make sure there's and we love, obviously, with Geoff's reaction there, we love emoticons, we love reactions. So if this is hitting the mark for many of you, please let us know. Also provide any kind of candid feedback. We're always open for that. Chad, anything on your end?
No further questions in the chat.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of close us out and then leave the final comment to you, Geoff.
Okay.
So really, I hope this has been a valuable use of your time to join Geoff and I. I know personally and professionally, I'm extremely excited about the pace in which the radio space is evolving. I've been in pharma and biotech for a long, long time, and the amount of investment, attention, and dedication in this field is probably unparalleled to anything I've seen. So as someone who is invested on a personal level and professional level, super exciting. And I hope that all aspects, adjacent and all the infrastructure, really continues to pull in the same direction. So Last words to you, my friend.
Well, Kathy, it's been great. I mean, we get to steal people. Radiopharmaceutical therapy is hot right now. Everybody can sense that. No pun intended. And we get to steal people like Kathy and bring in all this expertise and know-how from other industries that are related. And so that is also an interesting thing going on because there are significant differences both in the drug design, the supply chain, the clinical trial design that go into play, and as well as in the hospitals, how to get these things up and running in trials or in therapy. So we're all going through this transition, but there's this infusion of energy and people. And I hope that those of you who are listening, this answers some questions or helps with some guidance, but I would absolutely echo what Kathy's saying. This is an exciting time. It's very hard to imagine that 10 years from now, radiopharmaceuticals won't be more of a staple part of cancer therapy in multiple different cancers with significant investment. I'm sure there will be ups and downs, but there really isn't any cancer we can't treat if we can design the molecules well. And we can combine these with therapies, and we can really do a lot of exciting things going forward. So I appreciate those of you who are jumping into this field. Please stick with it. Thank you for being part of this exciting trend. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So from Geoff and I here in Rochester. Oh, Chad, I cut you off. Sounds like
I was going to share one final screen. If somebody didn't ask a question in the Q&A,
right,
they can either scan the QR code from their phone or send an email to either email address. So I can leave this up. Geoff, as you or KSB, you want to close this out? I'll leave this up, and people, if they want to get in touch, have the email addresses.
All right, I'll give it just a minute here because we're kind of already closing out. And yeah, a lot of excitement, a lot of new trials coming. Right now, if you were to say, okay, how many companies have launched in the last 5 years that are either developing, it's brand new startup company where their whole nidus was some technology or an actual radiopharmaceutical particular drug or pipeline, or companies that are developing ligands and other therapies that are now jumping into radiopharmaceutical, trying to convert in. And you're talking, more than 80 companies, probably, as we add in the converting companies, you're well over 100. And they're all now designing trials and moving forward. And, not all of those are going to work. But a lot of them look pretty good. And so I think, we're going to see a continued growth in multiple areas. I do think we're going to need multiple different radionuclides. I don't think you can just pick lutetium and be done. And we didn't even talk about the alpha versus beta emitters other than the supply chain. The alpha emitters, more precise, more powerful, a chance for a more robust benefit to the patient, potentially toxicity goes with any more powerful drug. So
that can be our second episode.
Yeah, that can be our second episode, but that's an exciting area going forward as well. So I'll give one last pause for any questions that could come in. Nothing?
Nothing.
All right.
Okay, super. Geoff, this was a pleasure.
Pleasure.
And pleasure for you all, I hope, as well. And we will be signing off live here in Rochester, Minnesota. Not Minnesota. And wish everyone a fantastic rest of your Thursday and week. Goodbye, everyone.